So hey everyone, I'm Ken, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about our Selenium infrastructure we have at Yelp. So a little bit about me. I've been at Yelp for about 4 years. I've kind of lived in the trenches, redesigning a lot of sites of, a lot of pages of Yelp.com. I've rewritten the homepage with a team of people, the sign up page, and search. I'm now transitioning into a new role where I lead a team called WebCore, which is basically our infrastructure for web developers. So first of all, what is Selenium? It's a test framework for web applications. The main goal of Selenium is to simulate user interactions. It's not really about getting nitty-gritty into code. You really want to live at the level of what your users would. You should be able to code it in any language, and you should be able to test every browser and every version in every operating system that's available. This is generally how your setup works. So you're going to have your test code, which is written in any language you want. It's usually going to communicate with a Selenium server that understands the Selenium protocol. And from there, it's going to launch up browsers like Firefox, Internet Explorer, Chrome, Safari, iOS, everything. So I want to go over a few terms before we get started on what I'm going to be talking about today. So there were a few different projects that came out of Selenium, and often people mix them up. They're known as Selenium Rc, which was kind of launched in 2004, Selenium IDE, and Selenium Webdriver. So Selenium Rc was the first implementation of Selenium. It basically executes JavaScript in the browser to get all the tests to work and to click on buttons and do things. There's a lot of examples of Selenium Rc code, especially out there on Stack Overflow. You probably want to avoid using Selenium Rc. If your company's currently using it, try to get away from it. We got away from it at Yelp a while ago. Selenium IDE was a cool idea, but we've never really used it at Yelp. The idea was that instead of manually writing all the tests, you should just be able to click on a browser and have it generate a test for you. We kind of feel like it's a little bit fragile, and we want to make reusable test code, which we're not really sure if the IDE would be able to do for us. Selenium Webdriver is the one that sort of replaced Selenium Rc in 2009. It still uses parts of Selenium Rc, but it addressed a lot of the design issues that came with Selenium Rc. The API for Selenium Rc was way more complicated than it needed to be, so they simplified it a lot. They also put in an object-based assign based on driving a browser and controlling elements on a page, which was a lot cleaner of an implementation. So I'm going to go through a couple examples of WebDriver. I'm going to use the Python library. You can use any library you want, but at Yelp we write a lot of Python, so that's what I'm going to be showing you today. So this is the kind of examples of things you can do with WebDriver. So the first thing we're going to do is make a WebDriver instance, and I'm going to connect to the Selenium server I have locally running on my machine. I'm specifically saying that I want to run Firefox. You can get into more detail than that if you want to. You can say I want specifically this Firefox version, and if it's not installed on the local machine, it will not run that version, it will just crash. You can do other cool things, like you can call implicitly wait, which basically tells WebDriver wait some time before you actually do interactions. So this helps with if you load a page and the page is not completely loaded and you try to grab an element that's not available yet, it'll actually give it up to 10 seconds for that element to be available on the page. Other things you can do are get pages on the web. You can do window management stuff, which is really cool. You can toggle between windows. You can switch in between iframes and control things within those windows. You can refresh the page. You can capture screenshots based on, when the test, let's say, fails. That might be a good time to take a screenshot and figure out what happened. And you can also select elements inside the page. And you can do this by CSS selector, XPath, ID, whatever you want. Once you actually have references to elements, this is where the web element API comes in. So you can find elements by CSS selector, then you can click on them, you can send character keys to them, and then you can select sub-elements within that element. This is one of the places where WebDriver did a really great job of simplifying the API. Selenium Rc used to have 10 different ways of sending characters to elements. What's underlying behind all of this is a REST API that's defined for Selenium WebDriver, which is great because it means that the protocol is language agnostic. People can write their own libraries. They can write proxies on top of this library. But this is generally what the requests look like. So in this particular case, we're getting a new session, and we're specifically asking for Firefox. Then on that session ID, we're starting to select some elements and maybe populating them with values. Remote WebDriver is the primary way we do Selenium testing at Yelp. There's an option to do local web driving, which is basically like your test connects directly to a Firefox instance with plugins. We actually we use the remote WebDriver because that's what we use when we actually do a deployment. So we have all of our engineers start up this simple proxy, which starts up browsers and you send commands to it, and it basically proxies the commands over to the actual browsers. The browser, the people who are actually developing the browsers are now actually implementing the plugins and systems that understand this WebDriver protocol, which is great. Including the IE team, IE11 has support for the Selenium WebDriver protocol, and it's actually implemented by the guys who write IE. So it's pretty close to being accurate as to what a user would actually do on a page. So I'm going to run through a really quick example of something we might have at Yelp as one of our tests. This one's a little bit silly, but this is kind of how it works at Yelp. So what we're doing is we've set up a simple test case, and we're saying, I want to run this test in Firefox, Chrome, and Safari. We're going to request a page of Yelp.com. We're going to do a search. So we're going to search for pizza, and we're going to search for it in San Francisco. Once we land on the search page, or actually then we're going to submit the search. Once we land on the search page, we're going to filter down and just look at pizza in Soma. And then we're going to look for 00 as like one of the top pizza places in San Francisco in Soma's area. The way this works is if it does not find that element by CSS selector, like if it cannot find that business 00, then you're going to get an exception, and that's where your test is going to fail. And then just for fun, I'm going to resize the map. This could be another thing that you might want to run inside your tests. So that's a test. I'm going to show you how we actually run it. So the first thing you have to do is start up your Selenium server on your local machine, which is pretty quick to do. And then from there, running the test, it kind of does these magical things. If it'll run. Cool. So we go to Yelp, search for pizza, San Francisco. We're going to filter down to Soma. And sure, 00 is there. And that was Firefox. Now we're going to rerun the same test in Chrome. Again, 00 is there. Last test, Safari. It's got to wait for every element and to load on the page, and the Wi-Fi is not fantastic. Come on, Selenium. There we go, yeah. Cool. Yeah, cool. So that's kind of what a Selenium test looks like when it runs. I think you can see that it's a lot faster to do that than me manually opening up every single browser, especially when you're talking about lots of versions of IE. It can be pretty painful to do this by hand. So yeah, that's kind of how it works. So I want to go over a little bit about how we write Selenium tests at Yelp. Obviously, we don't write code like that. We want our code to be reusable that we use in tests. We want to actually have flows that are meaningful, not just randomly doing things. So to go over our workflow that we have at Yelp, basically what we do is we start up a sandboxed environment. That basically gives us isolation from all of their tests running and isolation from test production code. From there, we're going to create some fixtures. So we're going to actually start populating the database with some stuff. Then we're going to execute a flow, and then we're going to confirm the side effects of that flow. So it's not that different from what you would write in any other test. And I don't think Selenium should be treated differently than any other test you would write at your company. So the one I'm going to kind of run through is what we might write for login and writer review. So the flow we're going to go through is the user logs in on Yelp.com, and then they go to the write a review page and write one of the reviews. So the first thing that we have at Yelp that's really useful is this thing called Sandbox. Basically what it does is it starts up a new MySQL instance, creates tables. It's going to run our Apache. It's going to bring up Memcache, bring up basically all the services that are necessary to run a test against Yelp.com. Then we can execute any command we want inside that sandbox, and then we can shut down the sandbox at any time. And this is kind of the utility we provide to all of our developers. It's really quick and easy for them to jump into a sandbox and then shut it back down. They can also not specify a command to sandbox, and then they just get dropped in a shell. And when they exit out of that shell, it shuts down the sandbox. So the first thing we got to do is create some fixtures. Before we can actually run anything in Selenium, we really, especially if it's a logged in experience, we're going to need to create a few things. So we're going to create a user, and we're going to create a business object based on an email and password. Once we actually have that, we can start thinking about what's the flow that we're actually trying to test. So the first one we're going to talk about is performing login. So we want to, given a WebDriver instance and given a user, actually go to the login page and log them into the site. Then the second action we really want to do is be able to perform write a review. So this is where you have a driver, you have a rating in mind that you want to give a review, and you have some text you want to insert into that review box. So we find elements in this list of stars, basically. We set the star rating to be, like, let's say, whatever, 3 stars. Then we're going to find the actual input where the review text is going to go in, fill in the review text, and submit the review. Then we want to think about what kind of assertions we want. So we want to confirm that the specific user actually is the one who wrote the review. So we'll write functions like this, where we take in the original user, the original business, the review text we expect, and the rating number. And we're going to assert that the business, which is a brand new business that we made at the beginning of the test, now has a single review. Its text that was in the database is exactly what we expect it to be. Same thing with the rating, and that the review was written by that specific user. Cool. Once we have all of those bits, we can start actually forming our tests. So I'm going to set up some really basic information, create my fixtures, perform the login. So this is actually going to go through and do the login steps. We're going to assert the user's logged in. Often people forget to do that kind of thing, and it results in tests kind of doing a weird thing where it says, oh, the user's review was never written, and it's hard to understand where exactly it broke in the flow. Then we're going to go to the write a review page. We're going to perform the write a review actions. And then we're going to assert that the user ends up on a page that actually says, like, hey, your review has been posted. Once we've told the user their review is posted, it should be in the database at this point. And that's where we're going to actually make the assertion that the user's written the review. Cool. Does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone have any questions? Pretty simple. Yeah? It's pretty quick. We're going to make it a lot faster using Docker. So that we can spin up MySQL instances and shut them down really quick. Same thing with Apache and everything else. I think our sandbox time is like, I don't know, like a minute probably. Yeah, but generally people keep their sandbox up all day. Yeah.
So you were doing this just in the browser showing Selenium.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any reason why you're not doing it headless, or are you doing that more headless or if it's one of this you kind of show off?
Kind of show off, yeah. You can hook this up to Phantom.js, and then you can run them completely headlessly. Another technique we have is using a Docker image, again, and I actually have Firefox in the Docker image, so it kind of feels like it's headless, but it's running a real Firefox instance. Yeah?
So, you mentioned before that you waited for things to load. Can you look up to events? Like, you get notified and maybe flow this will use this and it's loaded?
You can, it's not really hooked up to events. Again, you kind of want to work on the level of a user. So if you imagine you're a QA engineer and you're talking about what's happening on a page, Selenium's designed to work on the QA level. So a QA engineer doesn't really, or a QA person executing a test plan doesn't actually have the idea of when a page is loaded. They do have a good understanding of when something says your review has been posted, that's a good time to make the assertion. And Selenium lives on that kind of level, and you have to get into like the QA mindset and actually to write these tests. Yeah.
Sorry, along those lines.
Yeah.
So when you perform the write to the review, and then you're asserting that the page has been loaded, how do you account for the latency?
Right. So this is actually where implicitly wait comes in. So if you look at the assert user wrote, so the find element by ID, and I'm looking for alert message. It's a message that pops up on the next page they get to. But there's an implicit wait connected to find element by ID. The first page I'm on doesn't have that ID, so it's just going to do polling for about, our tests, in this case, we set it to 10 seconds. So for up to 10 seconds, it'll continually look for that. So you'll also get sort of an idea of your performance of how your sandbox is doing as well. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So this is why I really like these functions. Making these little tiny functions, and you can kind of compose them together. You can do all sorts of different combinations and just link them. It's kind of up to you. At Yelp, we have the developers write the tests. So you know if you have special cases for things like copy and paste. So it's sort of up to you if it makes sense. Do you need to test for that case? If you do, well, you have a bunch of things that you can compose together really nicely to make another test. Okay. I'm going to keep going, but I'll get back to your question. Cool. So another thing that we like to do at Yelp is we made this concept of a Selenium component. So it's great to write tests like this guy and have a bunch of reusable functions. But every so often, you're going to have widgets on a page that are appear on more than one page. And you want to write your test code to kind of be reusable as well. So if a widget has some JavaScript associated with it, you're going to probably write an API for people to interact with that component. We think the same thing is true on the Selenium side. We want to make a sort of nice API that wraps various elements on the page and sub-elements. So we sort of select the entire sign-up form, which maybe is really complicated. From there, we wrap it in this thing called the sign-up form, and it now has reference to that element. And it provides a front-end API, so you're not directly interacting with CSS selectors, which is also great if you ever rewrite your sign-up form. In theory, you can go back to the sign-up form class and just rewrite the selectors that are in there, and all your tests will suddenly work. So we really like this pattern for widgets, and we've been using it a lot at Yelp. Another one that a lot of people seem to use is this idea of a page object. So I'm doing this in Java because it's statically typed, and it makes it a lot more clear what it's doing. So maybe your whole login page has a class associated with it, and you instantiate it with a driver, and you can make assertions on whether or not that driver is actually on the home page or the login page. Then when you do actions like log in the user, if you know that your next page is going to be the home page, you return back a home page instance wrapping the driver. So you can do a whole sequence of log into the site, go to the home page. From the home page, what are the interactions you can do there, and provide APIs for every single page of your site that's reusable. So I really like this pattern. So why is Selenium important? Why does this stuff matter at all? I definitely think it gets you better coverage. I like unit testing. Unit testing is absolutely necessary for everything you do. We write unit tests for JavaScript. We write unit tests for our Python code, for everything we do in our back end. But it's not really sufficient. We've run into a lot of cases where people will do things in units and not test integration across from end to end. And that's not OK. Basically, it's never acceptable to break the most important flows on your site. Sign up is something that you can never have break. And if the reason is, well, I got unit test coverage, that's great. But in the end, if it breaks the most important flow on your site, that's a really big problem. So it's great to have at least an end-to-end test. So yeah, we like to have them at Yelp. The other thing I think we have to consider as well is that there's more client-side code. When we were doing things on the server, we could control the hardware and software that's spitting out the HTML that our pages are rendering, which was a lot of the work. And page refreshes also allow us to do a restart. So if something goes wrong for a user, they could reset the page, and kind of everything would be fine. Same kind of thing is true with JavaScript apps, but certainly we're putting a lot more control in our users' browsers than we used to. So client side, you have to deal with different JavaScript engines. A really minor bug could result in a blank page, which would be really awful. If you don't have Selenium coverage, often you'll get a lot of bug fixes inside of JavaScript unit tests, but then you won't actually know whether or not the page is working. Also, logging errors is a lot more difficult than JS when it's in the client. We log a lot of errors at Yelp that happen in JavaScript, and they come back in completely different formats depending on the browser. They also come back in different formats depending on the language that the user is using. So you get a lot of strings that are in German. So that can introduce a whole new set of problems that can come up. So I really think the Selenium stuff is really important as we switch more and more of our code to client side. I also think it's really important to understand like what the typical deployment cycle is, I think, for a lot of people. So usually we'll develop something in a dev environment. We'll build up our feature. In a lot of cases, we go to stage. So we go to some staging environment where we can confirm our code is exactly as we expect it to just before we deploy it to our production environment. With CI workflows, we're now kind of switching to this place where dev is your stage, and you confirm things on dev and go straight to production. But in the end, you're still doing some sort of stage testing. At some point, you're doing a staging environment of some kind. And then eventually, you're going to go to prod, and hopefully not everything's broken. I really dislike stage testing. We still do it at Yelp, but we're trying to avoid it as much as possible. It's tedious. It's really boring to do it. When you go to a staging environment, you start clicking around on stuff to make sure your feature's working. It's a little bit silly to do that when you could just write a test that'll do it for you. The other thing is it's error prone. You can definitely have developers who just miss things. If they're continuously updating a project, at some point they could miss something that they may have tested last time they pushed, but in this particular case they didn't. So we think it's really important that as much as possible, I try to get my engineers to not actually do anything on stage. They should be able to say, if the build is green, I know I'm ready to go to production, and I know the sign-up page on Yelp is not busted. So some common complaints that come up with Selenium, I've heard a lot of them from everywhere. Selenium is inherently flaky. It flakes out on you all the time. I think that is kind of true. Selenium Rc was definitely more flaky than WebDriver is. We were on Selenium Rc at Yelp for a very long time, and we eventually switched to WebDriver, and things like implicitly wait saved us a lot, because we could now have a way of saying, like, give it a couple seconds if this element's not there right away. Before, those would be silent failures and would cause a failure 1 in 3 times, maybe. It also requires a lot of education to understand what is going to cause a test to be flaky. Assertions like, are we on the business page yet, saying that the review's been posted, is really important. If you miss that kind of thing, you will have a test that will occasionally work and will occasionally will not. And it requires a lot of practice. I think that's also a really important thing, is that your engineers need to constantly be writing these Selenium tests. If they stop doing it for 6 months, you'll forget what are the small little details. So if you integrate this into your workflow constantly, it really helps to make a Selenium infrastructure not flaky. Another complaint that I hear, especially from small startups, is like, I don't have time to write Selenium tests. Like, this is a whole other infrastructure I've got to set up. I've got like some basic unit tests, good enough. My argument with that is you're always manually testing everything. You're going to get to a dev environment and you're going to test, does it work in all these cases? That's really, really tedious. So you should be able to avoid doing that. And Selenium testing is not that hard. I think you saw what I did, and it's not that complicated. I also argue that integration tests take a lot less time to write. If you're kind of strapped for time and you have to get a Selenium test, or you have to get some testing in place, I would much prefer an end-to-end test that tells me that my system's working than individual unit tests of every single little thing. So yeah, I think you do have time. And as I said before, it's really not that complicated. You saw me write a test there. It's like 10 lines of code. Getting something at least manually working on your local machine doesn't take any longer than this presentation. As I said before, the other thing you have to do when you're writing these Selenium tests, again, this is on the education side, is really emulate the user. You want to write things as a QA employee, not as an engineer. if you're injecting JavaScript into your page, you're probably not doing what something a QA employee would do. So you want to change that. So JavaScript injection on that topic. Avoid it as much as possible. We certainly have things at Yelp that we cannot do without JS. So we have to sometimes work around those rules, but we're really careful about doing it. This is, again, we're going on Stack Overflow. Often people will say, just inject this line of JS and everything will work. That's not a great way to do it. The events in JavaScript are not consistent across browser and version. They don't actually simulate what a user would actually do, so they might be inaccurate. There's also more security restrictions on what's going on in JavaScript. I can't open up a file uploader and like upload a file in IE8 in JS. That would be accessing a file system. It's not something you're going to be allowed to do. With Selenium, you can do that stuff. And like generally, WebDriver is going to try to fire events at the OS level. Like it's going to do things as closely as it can to what a user is going to do. Your hacky line of JavaScript is probably not going to do the same thing. So I'm going to go over adding Selenium to your stack if you're not already using it. I'd say like this is the minimal setup that I suggest to every startup and anyone who's even doing a side project. I run a Docker container that has Firefox and the Selenium server running inside of it. You can bring that thing up and down whenever you want to. And you can probably get something working in a couple days. Does anyone have any questions about setting something up like this? Yeah?
Do you happen to have a Vagrant file that does it?
You could do a Vagrant file too. The only thing with that would be it's a little bit slower to start it up. But yeah, Vagrant would work too. You can also just run the Selenium server like I did on my local machine. At the very least, run it on your local machine. But yeah, I think you can get something working definitely within a couple days. So Selenium at Yelp. Yelp is a site that we want to push as often as possible because we have lots of engineers and we want to change things rapidly. So we have 3 to 4 production pushes every single day. That would not be possible. We would not be able to make the assertions about our site still working if we're trying to keep on this kind of push schedule. We're also trying to get to a push schedule that's eventually you commit to master and it goes straight to prod. That, again, would not work unless we had automated tests. If we had a QA team, there would be no way we could get through 3 to 4 pushes to production in a single day. We're also currently using the Python library for all of our tests. Most of our engineers are writing stuff in Python. So we like to write our tests in Python as well. Currently, we're supporting Firefox, but we want to expand that out to basically every browser. It's a time commitment, and it's also a matter of not making our tests any slower by adding more browsers right now. So 4 years ago, when I actually started at Yelp, the infrastructure was set up by an intern who's still an employee today, and he does really, really good work. Smart guy. But generally, it is that easy to get something going inside your company. We only tested major flows, so the writer reviews, the signups, the logins, the compliment stuff. We tested the stuff that our CEO would be really upset if they were busted. We probably had about 40 tests somewhere in that area for Selenium. It took about 10 to 15 minutes to run our Selenium suite. And it was OK, but generally, our engineers were afraid of Selenium. If you added a Selenium test, it was like a scary thing to do because you potentially introduced something that was flaky. Again, partially because we were on Selenium Rc at the time. So today, we learned how to fix and avoid the flaky tests. We're definitely still learning about how to do it. It's not easy, but you can do it incrementally. We now have about 1,000 Selenium tests, and that number is growing really quick. So yeah, once you start to educate your engineers about how to do this and you make it so it's not so painful to get a test into production, it suddenly explodes into a lot of tests. It takes about 30 minutes to run our entire Selenium suite. We parallelize all of the test execution, so it's generally pretty quick. So dealing with flaky tests, a couple things to understand. Separate out flakes and failures. This is a really useful thing to do. So at Yelp, when a test fails, we will rerun it a few more times and get a sense of we're not going to give that test the same level of it's might as well be a passing test. We actually do mark it specifically as being flaky. So we know this test is not perfect. There's definitely some problems with it, but we were able to get through the flow that we really care about. And then we, every quarter, sort of try to figure out how do we get that percentage of flaky tests to go down consistently. Understanding failure versus flake is where a push will be stopped. If you see a test failure, that means it failed to pass 3 times. Something's probably really broken. So yeah, I would definitely say separate out the 3 concepts of this test definitely passes, it's good, it's a flake, and it's a failure. Cool. Avoid all the bad features in Selenium. They maintain the code injection thing because people do need it every so often. There's also a few other subtle things that you'll see in Selenium. Google around for it and make sure that it's actually an interface you really want to use. It has been cleaned up significantly since Selenium Rc, but you still have to be a little bit careful about how your developers use it. Enable implicit wait. If you are using WebDriver already and you don't have implicit wait turned on, some basic implicit wait of like maybe 5 seconds for waiting for elements to show up, that's a really useful thing to do, and I definitely suggest you do it. Also, get off Selenium Rc if you're still on it. Switch over to WebDriver. It's a huge improvement. Sauce Labs is also another thing we use at Yelp. This is a tool that allows, it's basically a service that you connect to and you can run Selenium tests against. Oh, by the way, the slides will be online too, so you can get them online. Okay. So I highly suggest to use Sauce Labs. We use it at Yelp to run all of our tests. The way it works is you connect into Sauce Labs' environment. You send them the Selenium tests you want to execute, and you say what browsers you want, and they already have VMs up and running for you to run your tests. You can send a lot of parallel requests at them, and yeah, it works out really well. They also provide something that a lot of people miss when they're saying, like, maybe I should use Sauce Labs. They actually do provide a tunnel into your dev environment. So if you're doing things on a staging server and that staging server is behind a firewall and not public, you can tunnel in for the duration of a test, which is another thing we kind of do just before the sandbox is set up. We start up a tunnel to Sauce Labs. So now Sauce Labs can see that dev environment. We start up the sandbox, run the tests, and then shut everything back down. And that's been really helpful for testing everything. To show you, I'm going to show you guys really quickly kind of like what the Sauce Labs page looks like. So this is for Bootstrap. Bootstrap wants to run all of their JavaScript tests in every single browser, in every single combination, because they get bug reports about them. Sauce Labs is free for open source, so whenever Bootstrap gets a pull request, they can run the entire Selenium suite in every single browser combination. So you can kind of see here, let's say like, I don't know, let's go for something really old. IE8 running in Windows. You can kind of see the output of their Selenium tests, their JS unit tests in this case. It also provides video playback. So if you have a test failure and you don't understand what happened with your build, you can actually watch it live. That's not good. Oh, there we go. Yeah. It also gives you the Selenium log, so you can understand like what were the commands that you were sending over to the Selenium server. So yeah, we use that at Yelp. Every time we do a production push, we're going over to Sauce Labs to actually run all our tests. Cool. The future, kind of what we want to do next with our Selenium infrastructure. Appium is a way of testing mobile apps. We have not done end-to-end mobile app testing at Yelp yet, and we really want to do it with Appium. It's based off of WebDriver. We can reuse our Selenium infrastructure. Sauce Labs also has simulators for all the versions of Android and iOS that we really want to test. So our iOS devs and our Android devs will now be able to write similar Python tests against their native apps. Where that's really powerful is if you've released a bunch of different versions of your app and you want to test it against your various backends or your latest version of your backend, you can tell Sauce Labs, here's a bunch of versions of my app. Please execute the following tests on all of them. And you can find out if you have an API change that's somehow breaking one of the important flows on maybe 3 versions ago. We also really want to open source our Python libraries. So we've written a couple wrappers around WebDriver, and I think every company does this. they wrap all of the WebDriver libraries to kind of block you or stop you from interacting with things that we know are not going to work. So we're looking to open source those libraries and utilities really soon. I also think we need continuous alerting and testing. So it's great to have Selenium tests that, let's say, interact with a third party. So as I was talking before, our signup process. Our signup process has a Facebook button on it. We want to be able to test whether or not that Facebook button actually works. And Facebook does provide an API to create these test users and try them out through a Selenium test. The problem is that Facebook could go down, or Facebook changes something, and we're not going to pick it up until our next build kicks off. And then everything's going to be on fire. For every developer, they're going to see a broken build. So that's not really acceptable. What we really want is we probably want to convert those tests to actually be alerts. So instead of running them as tests as part of our build, if we know it's connecting to a third party, we're going to run our tests against the third party continuously in prod. So as soon as something goes wrong with Facebook or any of the other third parties we integrate with, we can tell them exactly when our test went from working to failing. So yeah, some Selenium resources. Definitely check out seleniumhq.org. That's basically where all of the client libraries you're going to want for all your programming languages. Also, that's where the Selenium server is. I highly, highly suggest you keep up to date with the latest versions of browsers and the latest versions of Selenium servers. If you're living with bleeding edge Firefox and you're using an old Selenium server, often they will not work together. In some cases, Firefox gets kind of ahead and somehow it breaks the Selenium server completely. So you have to get your developers to continually upgrade both their Firefox versions and their Selenium servers on their local machines. My slides are available there on GitHub. Also, I'm always happy to help. You can message me on Twitter. I'm from San Francisco. Yelp is in San Francisco. So if you're here and you're starting to set this stuff up, or you already have it set up and you just want to learn about what we did that's different, you can message me on Twitter. Yeah. Also, plug for my company. I want to work with really passionate people who like this stuff. So if you're looking for work and you want to work at Yelp, come talk to me. Cool. Any questions? Lots of questions. Cool. Yeah. So collecting stuff from the browsers, again, Selenium's not really well designed for it. So as soon as you start doing that stuff, you're going to tie yourself down to one specific browser. And then you cannot say that I can run this test on every single browser. To some degree. One thing that we do at Yelp is anytime there's ever a JavaScript error, we're catching all JavaScript errors, and we actually delete the whole page and throw the JavaScript error up on the page. Then our Selenium test is basically what a QA engineer would see. I don't know what happened, but there's a giant stack trace dump on the page. I'm going to go and tell the engineer. We do it right on the page. We delete everything in the DOM and replace it with a stack trace that is our JavaScript error. This is where our subclass of WebDriver and that element is very useful. Every time you try to select an element, before we select the element, we check to see is the error on the page. And then we can report back to the test runner that the whole page crashed. And that works in a headless browser too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so our sandbox environment is kind of test data, right? We set up a new MySQL instance, do everything from scratch. We kind of want to play with production data, but that's where you could get into even more flakiness. You're only going to make so many test users on your production environment, and if they all start running tests at the same time, then yeah, you're going to have weird behavior on your product, probably. I don't think most developers account for the same user interacting a lot at the same time. Yeah. Yeah, that's a tricky one. I tried to TDD my Selenium tests. I tried, but it didn't really work. My markup format was changing, and so my day-to-day is I will usually write incrementally a feature, and then write a matching Selenium test for that feature. And I'm usually, most of our developers are working on like sort of single sections of the site, like write a review. I will make an update and then run locally all the write a review tests. Takes a couple minutes, and then from there I'll post a code review and maybe kick off a real build and push it to prod. Sorry? Yes, yes. Nothing goes to production unless it's been run through an entire build of everything at Yelp. Yeah.
When you're doing grid runs,
yeah.
do you spin up a separate sandbox for each of the browsers?
No. So remember, we're also running Firefox, but generally, so we're only running Firefox. We're not running a whole bunch of different browsers yet. But we do run, I think, some number of like probably 50 tests in a single sandbox serially. We do want to parallelize that out and run a single test. Like every single test would have its own sandbox, but the resources are kind of insane unless you're using something like Docker to bring it up and down.
Do you run into a lot of test determination with that?
Not that much, no. Generally, people know when they're writing tests, like create a new user. That's kind of the first thing they have to do. So, as long as the users aren't somehow smashing into each other, it's usually okay. Yeah. Got lots of questions.
Is it a good idea to avoid executing JavaScript using the Selenium command? Would that make tests more flaky?
Yes, definitely. It's just not designed for it. I find engineers will often say, like, I really need to know what's going on in JavaScript, especially with things like if you have an MVC app, you'll want to inspect the models. It just doesn't work very well. The Selenium community, like, they've designed it in a way that they don't want you to do that. So they're not accounting for it when they're writing their code. I would avoid it as much as you can. This is really good for doing the level of a QA engineer. If you want to know that level of detail, write some unit tests in JS. Guy in the back was really into it, yeah. Yeah. I have not used it. I have heard about it, but generally, we were considering that at some point. Like, do we have our front-end engineers write code in JS? The fact is, we have most of our code is written in Python, and I would say stick with the language you know. But yeah, I think the Node community is getting better and better about writing these libraries. Definitely, I'd say the best two in terms of support for Selenium are probably Java, because the Selenium server is written in Java, and Ruby. But I think the Ruby community, a lot of them has switched to JavaScript, and I think there's probably really good stuff going on there. Yeah.
I actually have two questions.
Sure.
Why the selection of Selenium or something like Cucumber with Webdriver
Just mainly just to build out Python against no, or was it more of
It was more stick with what you know. I think that was the primary thing. The big thing we had to change at Yelp was we had to change people's opinions of how this thing worked. They thought it was flaky, and they're like, only test the most important flows. But then we got a lot of bug reports of very minor features being broken. And those took a lot of time to fix. So convincing people that it's okay, like, just write these things. If there was the overhead of switching to another language, they might not have done it. We could open it up in the future to whatever language we want, but that Python stuff worked for us. Yeah.
I'm guessing that, again, changing the culture, as you said, how long did it take to persuade that team to start really utilizing Selenium in their daily process?
Hard to say. I don't know if I've sold everyone on it yet. Definitely the people who work on, I'd say like one of the best ways of doing it is when you have a project and devs see you do it. So I had a couple interns who were writing sign up with me, and they were manually testing everything. And I told them, I'm going to write the Selenium suite, and I'll let you guys write all the code. And I saw them physically clicking and doing stuff on the sign-up flow and constantly have to switch to a new email address because you couldn't sign up with the same email address. And then they saw me hit a button and just sit there and watch. And that definitely was like, oh, this is really appealing. So yeah, I'd say like we're still convincing people, but certainly people who have worked with web developers who have used Selenium, I think they're like, oh yeah, this thing is worth having. Yeah. Yeah. We kind of have that infrastructure built into our test infrastructure. The other big thing is do not special Selenium into some other special snowflake box that's different from the rest of your tests. Our test infrastructure is set up in a way that it runs every test 3 times to assert for flakiness. The same thing is done with Selenium, but that's, yeah, kind of internal. Yeah. Yeah. The metric is we trust our engineers. When engineers make a change, they kind of make the decision, did I change something that could affect the front end? And they can manually trigger a Selenium run from their dev box. When we do actual pushes to production, we basically merge in a bunch of branches, make a single deploy branch, kick off a build, and then if the build is clean, there's one person who's responsible for doing the push to prod. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I really want to do it. Twitter does this, and they have 8 users who just like follow and tweet at each other all day in the production environment, which is a little silly. But I think the problem is you can run into a lot of flakiness where people start ignoring. It's the same thing with all alerts. People start ignoring them if they tend to go down a lot. And there can be a lot of external factors that could knock down a Selenium test, for sure.
So you said that you don't QA is not writing the test?
Yep.
Why not?
We don't have a QA department.
You said if you had a QA department, you couldn't
Yeah, I think I mean, we would not be able to execute. I worked in sort of more traditional software company at some point, and they had test plans, and they would execute all the test plans before release. And I think a lot of companies are in this spot where they have like a 2-week release cycle. We want to continue to do this push constantly thing, including a QA department to actually do manual testing. Like, it just wouldn't work. One thing we do have manual testing in some way, which is we often push things to production with a toggle that turns off the feature, but our engineers are constantly using it, and we can release it to everyone internally at the company, or 1% of users. So that's kind of our QA team comes out of the fact that our engineers like to use the product. Yeah. Yeah, so we, as I said, I think it takes about 30 to 40 minutes to run all of our 1,000 Selenium tests. And the way we're doing that is we have a few different boxes we use and a few different sandboxes and a bunch of tunnels to Sauce Labs. And the great thing too is Sauce Labs has their VMs up. So you don't have to, after every test run, it's not shutting down a VM and bringing one back up. So it's pretty quick to run a testing on Sauce.
Do you have any opinion on CSS versus XPath with regards to flakiness?
Not with flakiness, but developers, front-end engineers don't know XPath. So I encourage people to use CSS. It's not as expressive as XPath, so there are some cases where you have to use XPath. But again, I find it way more important that our engineers are writing the tests than how they're doing it.
So we've already implemented some started Python, but is there any movement to JavaScript so you can get code coverage utilizing some of the JavaScript unit tests?
We have unit tests that are completely independent that run in JS.
But running Selenium Webdriver in order to run the code coverage that you can get from some of the
Oh.
because Python, I can't find anything similar. You guys invested a lot about code coverage at all?
So we have code coverage for Python code. We haven't done it for JavaScript yet.
Yeah. And that's where we're considering switching to JavaScript with our Python because the code coverage is more
Yeah, I guess like you could at the beginning of a Selenium test, like put you in an environment where it's a tracking coverage. I think there's ways you could do it. We could talk about it after. I think we're probably running out of time.
One sec.
Yeah.
Have you guys had run into rendering in terms of not having the full list? The final element will be not visible on the full list, and there's no real visible element.
Yes.
That's a little trickier when you have a list and you don't have the full, list rendered, and you want to make sure once you scroll, you actually render that particular index.
Yeah, so this is, again, where Selenium is different from injecting JS. So the question was just basically about what happens if something's not visible on the page? Can you interact with it? Generally, Selenium is going to say, can a test engineer see it? No? Then no, you can't click on it. JavaScript, you're going to get away with it. But Selenium is designed to scroll automatically to positions of elements. So it should be set up in a way that it can get to the element you'd expect. One thing we do at the very beginning of all of our Selenium runs is maximize the size of the window, because sometimes the window will not be maximized for some reason in some browsers. Also, make sure your resolution you're running on is high enough that it's reasonable. We used to run our tests on 1024 by like 768, and like it barely fit anything, and then that caused subtle rendering issues. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Yeah.
At what point do you say a certain code is production ready?
Yep.
After production ready, if what you're talking about fails, at what point do you say, when you publish, probably recall back?
So we have a rollback mechanism that's like, when we're doing a push to production, everyone who's involved in a change set is in an IRC chat room talking about it. When it goes to prod, you're responsible for monitoring all the systems that you've changed. So there's a designated person who's the push master who will say, I'm seeing a new error that I haven't seen before. Can someone please figure out whose change this is? And then it's kind of up to that person to decide this is a rollback, like please roll back immediately, we'll redo the build. Or they can talk to their PM, and the PM might say, okay, how many times is it failing? Like, can we just get an emergency update? Oh, we got to wrap up. Yeah, yeah. It's in a lot of cases we still have a very big code base, like a single code base that deploys by itself. But we still do have services as well that are isolated. Yeah.